you show up for pets every day. It's because care is your calling, and it's ours too. We know it's what drives you to make a difference in the health and well-being of every pet. That's because at Zoetis, hundreds of veterinarians are part of our team too, working with you to provide science-backed medicines, technology, and practical support to help elevate your standard of care. Learn more at careisyourcalling.com.
From the Soapbox is the official podcast for the American Animal Hospital Association's digital newsroom, Trends. Here, we take inspiration from the familiar soap notes, but instead of looking at the condition of a patient, we're diagnosing and discussing the state of the veterinary industry. We'll chat about the challenges, trends, and innovations shaping the veterinary world with voices from across the community. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Singler. Thanks for listening. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of From the Soapbox. My guest today is our very own Dr. Ingrid Taylor, a veterinarian and AAHA's Director of Guidelines. So if you've ever heard about AAHA's guidelines and aren't completely sure what they are, or if you're just curious about how they're created, this is the episode for you. We talked about how topics are chosen, how the task force members are selected, and how important it is to have members with diverse perspectives and backgrounds on the task force. We also learned a little bit more about Dr. Taylor, including her background working in emergency medicine in the Air Force and as a writer before coming to work for AAHA. She also shared some of her thoughts and experiences on inclusivity for veterinary professionals with disabilities, advancements in technology, ethical considerations for veterinarians, and the emotional state of animals. Lots to cover, so let's get into it. Here she is, getting her time to talk from the Soapbox, Dr. Ingrid Taylor. Dr. Ingrid Taylor, welcome. I'm so excited to have you here on the podcast with me.
Hi, Dr. Singler. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm excited to be here today.
Awesome. Yeah, I've been looking forward to this. You and I have been kind of chatting about this for a little while, so I'm excited that we're finally both here together. Because we talked previously on the podcast a while ago about standards and the role that they play in AAHA accreditation and for AAHA members and sort of the community to learn from in general. So I'm excited for more of our audience to learn more about the guidelines, the amazing work that you do, and understand how they can use them. But before we get into all of that, I would love for our audience to get to know you a little bit more. If you don't mind sharing whatever you would like to share in terms of your story in veterinary medicine, in terms of maybe where you started, how you got to where you are now, and then a little bit about your current role as the Director of Guidelines here at AAHA.
Sure. Well, I graduated from veterinary school way back in 2006 from Washington State University. And when I initially got out as a new graduate, I went right into emergency and critical care, which was definitely a trial by fire. But I got to see a lot of interesting cases and really got kind of immediately immersed in the daily practice of veterinary medicine. After that, I spent several years in general practice. And then I went into the Air Force as a public health officer and served in the Air Force in that capacity. During that time, I experienced a disabling injury. And when I got out, I was kind of searching for what my place was in veterinary medicine after going through that experience. I will say that at the time, and this was about a decade ago, I didn't feel that veterinary medicine was particularly welcoming to people with disabilities. And in my case, for someone with a disability that is not evident immediately to the eye when you look at me, I did feel like that was a struggle to kind of figure out where I belonged in the profession after that. So I had always enjoyed writing. I went on and got a master's of fine arts in fiction and nonfiction writing, and went into freelance writing. While also kind of staying updated, kind of staying involved in some things in veterinary medicine. I was writing a lot about animals and animal issues. And one of the jobs I had that actually, I think, kind of directly led to me working for AAHA in this capacity as director of guidelines, is that I was a technical editor working on environmental assessments. So I had that experience of being able to manage long, complex technical documents. And so when I saw this position for the guidelines for working with the AAHA guidelines open up, I was very intrigued by it. I had known about the guidelines as a practitioner. I had used them in the past. I had worked in AAHA accredited practices before. And yeah, so I kind of took a leap and applied for the position. And it's been a steep learning curve. It's been a really it's been really exciting work to do, and I feel that I've learned so much about the veterinary profession, and just learned so much in this job. Uh, so what I actually do as the director of guidelines is that I manage the entire guidelines publication process, from selection, from determining which topics we're going to publish within a calendar year, to every step of the publication process, starting with topic selection, selecting task forces, the writing, editing, review process, the design and layout process, until ultimately the guidelines are published.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for sharing all of that and for your openness there. I'm so sorry for both the injury that you experienced and for your experiences not feeling always welcomed or like you had a place in veterinary medicine. I think that's important feedback for all of us to hear, so that we can continue to make progress and making our industry a more open and inviting space for everyone.
Thank
Um,
you. Yeah, thank you for that, Emily. And I think the good thing is, like I said, this was probably over a decade ago, and I think one of the good things is that these issues are now more out in the open, and they now are being more openly discussed within the profession, and I think that's a wonderful thing. So I personally have seen a lot of progress in these areas, and of course, there's always more work that can be done, but I'm encouraged to see the kind of progress that has been made over the past decade or so.
yeah, I am as well, and I'm glad to hear that's your experience as well. And I was going to say, when you were talking about the job for the director of guidelines, your current position, as I've gotten to work with you, definitely your attention to detail is just amazing. So I think this is the perfect. I don't want to. This is the perfect role for you. I don't know if that's appropriate for me to say, but I feel like you're perfect for the position, because you have that ability to manage all of these different timelines and these very, very detailed write ups, and working with all of the specialists that you work with. And I'm sure we'll get into that. Um, but we really appreciate the very, very detailed, very careful, very meticulous work that you do, to make the guidelines what they are.
Oh, thank you so much. Those are very kind words. And
Of course.
I do think that this type of position does kind of require both an attention to detail and sort of always keeping in mind the big picture as well. Because, of course, we want that attention to detail. We need our guidelines to be accurate and rigorous, but we also need our guidelines to be meeting the broader need and the broader context of what's going on in the veterinary profession as well. So I would say those are kind of the dual aspects of the position that are really important to be successful in it.
Definitely. Very good point. So, yeah, I just want to kind of start at the beginning for those who maybe don't know. We did an episode several months ago, like I mentioned before, on the standards of accreditation. And sometimes I hear, I will sometimes edit work done by freelancers or read questions or comments made by others who maybe are not all that familiar with all of um, the different things, all the different work that we do at AHA, who seem to sometimes use the terms standards and guidelines almost kind of interchangeably, or that they maybe don't have a clear understanding of the difference between the two of them and how they're meant to be used. So could you just start out by explaining what AHA's guidelines are and what they're meant to do, sort of what their reason for existing is?
Thank you for this question. I do see this confusion a lot, and the the guidelines the guidelines are standard and standards are two separate um, products. I don't know if that's exactly the right, two separate offerings that AHA creates, and the guidelines are consensus-based guidance that draw upon current evidence to define best practices within veterinary medicine. They are something that is intended to help veterinary teams provide optimal care for their patients. And they're also intended to be flexible enough to accommodate clinical judgment based on the cases that veterinarians have before them. So the reason that they exist is to help veterinary teams navigate these complex clinical and practice management issues, and also to hopefully help provide some guidance for some of the gray areas of veterinary medicine where maybe we don't have a preponderance of evidence or studies that have been done, but we have expert experience that can provide some guidance in those areas. So another important aspect of the guidelines is that they are open and available to anyone in the veterinary profession. They're always available for free to access on the AHA website, and they're also available through the Journal of the American Animal Hospital Association. And they are really intended for the entire veterinary profession to be able to use and benefit from them. The standards are specifically for member practices who are accredited or pursuing accreditation, and they define they are basically stringent quality standards that define the best practices within those member practices, and they can cover everything from pain management to anesthesia to medical record keeping, and these are qualifications that practices must meet to become and maintain accredited by AHA. So they're not something that is widely available to the entire profession, unlike the guidelines. They're a specific path to accreditation for practices that choose to pursue that.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very helpful to understand. And I think we can all understand why those who haven't done a deep dive on standards and guidelines maybe don't know the difference between the two of them, because they both, are words that could be used to describe, what are best practices? What should I aim to do? How can I accomplish whatever the particular topic is? With the best evidence in terms of the best practices. But yeah, it's really helpful, I think, to hear that definition and that the standards really, the guidelines are really available for anyone who wants to use them as a reference. And we have so many different guidelines, and I wanted to sort of ask you if you could sort of walk us through the process, sort of what's involved in creating a new set of guidelines, or maybe it's renewing a set of guidelines that was made several years ago, from like picking a topic to convening a task force, or what kinds of individuals end up being on the task force, to actually creating the guidelines. What do you think that it would be helpful for others to know about that process?
There are a lot of steps involved in creating the guidelines. It is a very long and detailed process. So I'm going to give a little bit of a high-level overview of what that process is like.
Perfect.
From start to finish, it takes about 12 to 18 months to publish a guideline. That's from knowing what the topic is, getting the task force together, getting through the writing and editing period, and then ultimately getting the guidelines published, both on the AAHA website and in the Journal of the American Animal Hospital Association. Once guidelines are published, they are considered to have a lifetime of about 5 years. So that doesn't necessarily mean we update every single guideline at the 5-year mark. What that does mean is that at 5 years, that triggers an audit of the guidelines where we look at the topic. We look at what's currently going on within the veterinary profession. We look at whether any of the recommendations or information in the guideline is outdated and need to be updated based on current clinical practice, based on current research. We look at whether, are there new drugs out that we need to be talking about? Are there new procedures, or is there new technology out that we need to be talking about? So based on that, that will determine whether a guideline gets updated or not. Some of them stay on the website longer. Some of them get updated more frequently. For example, our diabetes management guidelines, those were published in 2018. We updated them again in 2022, and now have just updated them again and split them apart so that we now have a focused cat diabetes management guidelines, and we will have a focused dog diabetes management guidelines, both of which the cat diabetes is already out and the dog diabetes will be coming later this year. So in that situation, there was so many advances happening within the field of diabetes management that it was necessary to do more frequent multiple updates for these guidelines. So that's just one example, whereas we have other guidelines that are able to stay on for longer because the field is maybe not changing as quickly, or the information is still relevant for clinical practice. So that is one path where we decide on a topic for a guideline. If it is a guideline we currently have published that needs to be updated, then that guideline goes on our list for topics to be updated and republished. The other path for selecting a topic for a guideline is brand new guidelines. And those are topics that are perhaps up and coming in veterinary medicine, topics that a lot of primary care practitioners are concerned about or thinking about, that would benefit from the type of guidance that the guidelines provide. So, and those topics can come to us in a variety of ways. They may be suggested by some of our member practices. They may be suggested by other members of the veterinary community, or maybe our board of directors has, based on their experience and knowledge of the profession, they may suggest some topics. And sometimes those topics are suggested by our corporate sponsors as well, who are often plugged into what the current research is in a given field. So those are two different ways where we might get together a list of guidelines topics to publish within a calendar year. And our goal is to publish 3 guidelines within a calendar year. So once those topics are decided on, the topics are all approved by our board of directors. And once they're decided on, then I create the publication plan in terms of which guidelines are going to go first and in which month for the upcoming calendar year. And the planning actually takes place, like the guidelines you're seeing published this year, the planning actually started 2 years ago for those guidelines, because the task force meeting occurs at least a year before the guidelines are published. And it basically takes that long to get through all of the writing and editing and careful reviewing of the guidelines to make sure that when they come out, they are as accurate and as rigorous as possible. So from there, once we know the topics, then we start getting together nominations for our task forces. And our guidelines task forces are really unique among the type of clinical guidelines and clinical consensus statements that are out there, because it's very important for us to include a diversity of viewpoints and within the veterinary profession in these guidelines. Because our guidelines are intended for primary care practitioners, we always want to make sure that we have that perspective on the task force. So our guidelines task forces are made up of generally 4 to 5 board certified experts within the field of the topic. We also include a primary care practitioner on the guidelines. And again, the reason for that is because the guidelines are intended for that population of the veterinary profession. So it's important to have their perspective. Often the primary care practitioners, they bring the kind of questions that we need to be answering in the guidelines. Like, I am seeing this daily challenge in practice with this particular topic. What kind of expert advice can we give to help guide through those issues? So their participation is extremely important in the guidelines. Another group that participates in the guidelines that is extremely important is the primary care veterinary educators. We always try to have a representative from this group on the guidelines, and these are the people who are in the veterinary colleges who are teaching veterinary students about primary care, and they often bring an incredible perspective to the guidelines in terms of, what students are learning, what kind of knowledge new graduates are coming out with, and, how these guidelines can maybe help with some questions and gaps for that part of the profession. The other very important member of the task force is the credentialed veterinary technician. We always have representation from a credentialed veterinary technician, often, if available, someone who has a VTS in the particular topic. And again, their input is invaluable to the guidelines because they're able to bring in, for clinical topics, how can technicians be involved in this? How can efficiency be increased by optimizing the role that technicians play and what they can bring to this clinical topic? So that's generally. Oh, and we also have a DA/BVP practitioner on the guidelines as well. So that is basically the makeup of a guidelines task force. And again, we want to have a representative viewpoints from all these aspects of the professions to be able to meet the kind of questions that primary care practitioners have, while also having the very strong representation from board certified experts in the field. So once the task force has been, once we have a nominees list for the task force, that goes to our board of directors for approval. And then once that's approved, I start sending out invitations to the short list of our nominees. Once the task force is put together, they meet virtually over 2.5 days, where they actually sit down and go through the guidelines, go through what they want to put in the guidelines. We have multiple discussions over those 2.5 days, and we start building out what's going to be in the guidelines. From there, once the task force meeting has ended, each task force member leaves with their own writing assignment to complete. They turn those in about a month later, and that begins the whole editing and reviewing process. The guidelines are reviewed not only by our internal clinical teams, by our board of directors, but also by external reviewers as well, who have had nothing to do with the creation of the guidelines process. They're experts in the field, and they also review the guidelines. And that's a really important quality check of the guidelines, a really important check to make sure that that we haven't missed anything, that we've covered what we need to cover, and that the information is appropriate and it, and useful for primary care practitioners. So once the guidelines are through this very extensive editing and review process, then they go into design and layout, and that's when they get put into the form that everyone recognizes on the website. And from there, they once that step is done, then they are ready for publication. And I know I just talked a whole lot, so I
I
will
love that.
pause there. Of course, there's
Yeah.
lots of individual steps at each point along the way, but that's just sort of a high-level overview of the
Yeah.
process.
I think that's a great overview. Thank you. I wanted to add a couple things. I know for some of the guidelines, particularly like the One Health guidelines and the community care guidelines, you've incorporated other experts like veterinary social workers or even human physicians, RNs, things like that as appropriate. So I just wanted to call that out, that there are cases when that type of expertise comes from outside, perhaps those who work in veterinary clinical practice all the time. I think it's amazing and very helpful that we can invite those types of individuals to be part of the task force and have their input. And then perhaps on a less serious note, I love that every guidelines has a specialized formatted mascot to represent the topic and represent the guidelines. Just as a member of the AAHA team, I feel like that's one of my favorite things, is when you come to us and show us the idea, or we kind of brainstorm it. And I love that for diabetes, for example, that the little kitty has like a CGM on, and just all those little details. Or we'll think of a breed that goes along with perhaps being more predisposed for a particular condition. And I just think that's such a fun little detail that you also put a lot of work into, to working with the artist and taking ideas and feedback. So
I love the
I appreciate that aspect.
Yeah.
I hope that others do too.
Yeah, the mascots are a lot of fun, and I love that we can be while we well, our goal is to produce these clinically rigorous guidelines. It is nice that we can also be a little lighthearted and a bit fun about it, and have these fun mascots. And yeah, the creative process for the mascots is a lot of fun, coming up with the concept art. And I have wonderful coworkers who always come up with really wonderful ideas for this too. And working with the artist Lily Chin is fantastic. She's wonderful, and I would recommend everyone go to her Instagram and follow her and follow her work. So,
She's so talented.
yeah. And thank you for bringing up the earlier point about the One Health guidelines. And it is really important that we have the flexibility to be able to design task forces specific to the topic. And I think that has really spoken to the strength of the guidelines and the strength of the recommendations that have come out in the guidelines and how topics have been covered. And one example, you mentioned the One Health guidelines, which is a great example. That was really the first time that veterinary professionals and professionals from the human medical profession sat down together and talked about how they can collaborate better for the benefit of both human and animal patients. So those guidelines were really breaking new ground in that sense. And it was really amazing that we were able to bring all those experts together from different professions and have that kind of discussion. The other guidelines I'd like to call out are the technician utilization guidelines, which our normal makeup of task forces have a majority of veterinarians on the task force. For the technician utilization guidelines, that of course wasn't appropriate. So we have two veterinarians represented, and the rest of the task force was all made up of veterinary technicians, which really, really contributed to the strength of those guidelines and the practicality of those guidelines and relevance of those guidelines. So it is really wonderful that we're able to approach this with a flexibility and be able to adapt task forces to what is needed to create good guidelines.
Yeah, that I agree. That's a very important call out, to be able to have, like you said, that flexibility to say, okay, who would really make the most sense to have on this task force? Who is going to give us the most, knowledgeable, evidence-based, expert information that is also applicable and practical and going to be easy to implement for the people who are going to use the guidelines as a resource. So definitely for tech utilization, yeah, wouldn't make sense to have it any other way. And so thank you for sharing that. I'm curious to know. So you've put, you've done this extensive, 2-year long process to create these guidelines, and then as you said, they're put into they go to design, they get formatted, they're beautiful, they have um, the artist drawing of the mascot, and then they come out. They're on our website, and they're also in AAHA. And so it ends up being this combination of of text and graphics and charts, and just it's very, very comprehensive information on whatever the topic is. That just from my experience, I have sometimes gone and kind of read a whole section, or I've gone and looked up, just kind of one little thing that I wanted to know. So I imagine they're used all kinds of different ways, including, maybe some people who want to read the whole thing from start to end versus some who just want to refer to a specific chart or read a paragraph or about how to, conduct a workup on a particular condition or that kind of thing. I'm curious what kinds of feedback you get, because I know you do get a fair amount of feedback. You get emails and that kind of thing from veterinary professionals. What kind of feedback do you get about the guidelines and sort of what they mean to veterinary teams or how they're being used or whatever people are sharing with you? Just curious to know.
I generally get a lot of positive feedback about the guidelines, and it sometimes comes in kind of surprising ways. I do get a lot of questions from people in terms of sometimes clarifying, like, how, this specific point in the guidelines, am I interpreting this correctly? So I do get a lot of questions about interpretation of the guidelines, particularly guidelines that are in topics that kind of touch on more of these gray areas in veterinary medicine. I get a lot of questions about vaccinations and overdue vaccinations. That's one of those areas where we just don't have a preponderance of research and studies that to really direct recommendations. So I do get a lot of those types of questions. But I would say overwhelmingly the feedback is positive. I have heard from educational institutions, veterinary colleges who are using the guidelines with their veterinary students. I was actually just recently contacted by a guide dog school that is using the canine vaccination guidelines. I would say for the most part, the majority are primary care veterinary clinics that are using the guidelines, but there's just a lot of range in terms of who is using them and who is referencing them. We also have a lot of international practices that are using the guidelines, and we've actually had the guidelines translated into several different languages at this point. to be used internationally. One of the kind of fun and surprising things, though, is that sometimes I'll be at a conference watching a presentation and all of a sudden the guidelines are referenced, or suddenly there's a table or chart on the screen from the guidelines and the speaker is talking about that. And seeing that always makes me really happy that, they're in a lot of different areas and used, I would say, in a lot of different ways, whether as a reference, whether as a clinical guidance. And there, I always really appreciate just the number of different ways that the guidelines are used.
That's got to make you feel good. Like, hey, I remember seeing that. I remember making that, seeing it up on the screen.
Yeah, I'm always happy to see the word getting out. And I really, in terms of that, in terms of it, I definitely don't consider the guidelines mine. I mean, I really have to call out the amazing experts that volunteer for our task forces, and they put an incredible amount of work into creating these guidelines. And every person who has served on a guidelines task force, every expert is so dedicated to the veterinary profession, so dedicated to giving practical guidance on what is the best thing that we can do for our patients, what is the best thing that we can do for our clients. And really it's them that I think need to be elevated in this discussion, because they just do an incredible job of creating these guidelines, and I'm happy to be there to help the process along. But I would say it's our experts and our task force members that put so much into it, and our reviewers as well. They are our external expert reviewers, our volunteers. They take on this voluntarily. They look through what are sometimes very long documents. So I think they also have to be called out.
Yes, definitely. Their work is so important, and you're very gracious. Of course, we recognize them for all the amazing work that they do. Obviously, we wouldn't be able to have guidelines without their input. I'm curious to know if there are any guidelines that you've been a part of working on over the years that particularly stand out to you for any reason, either because of how different the topic was or how challenging it was to kind of go through the process of creating them, or just funny stories associated with them. Is there anything, what memories stand out to you over the years from your time working on the guidelines?
Well, I would say all of the guidelines are challenging in different ways.
Yeah.
Some of them are very technical, like our fluid therapy guidelines. And for some, we are breaking new ground, or we're creating completely new topics. So, like, for example, our One Health guidelines. So, they're all challenging in different ways. There are different challenges with each one, and I think that's something that makes the work so interesting. But I would say, again, in terms of the great memories I have over the years, it's really how the veterinary profession has responded to the guidelines. How, if I've been out at a conference and, someone knows my involvement with the guidelines and comes up and says, I used these guidelines and it was it's great. I'm happy that they're there. That is something, that's something that I file away in the happy memories. And also just being able to get to know the range of experts that I've gotten to know over the years, and the range of members of the veterinary profession that I've gotten to know over the years. It's been a really personally enriching process for me. And actually, if you don't mind, if I just wanted to return quickly to the question about the kind of feedback I get from the guidelines, because there was something else that I just wanted to address. While I do get mostly positive feedback about the guidelines, I do find that people are often confused about the role of corporate sponsors and the role that they play in the guidelines. So I wanted to just maybe take a moment to clarify that. We do have corporate sponsors who sponsor our guidelines, and they are the reason that we are able to offer these, free access for anyone to be able to use. Without our corporate sponsorship, basically what those sponsorships go to are things like paying for our guidelines task force facilitator, who right now it's our task force facilitator is Dr. Mia Carey, and she is absolutely amazing. She is someone who has specialized training in facilitating the types of discussions that we have during the task force meetings. And because of our corporate sponsorship, we have the funds to be able to have such an incredible facilitator. And we need to get a lot done within the 2.5 days of the task force meetings. And it simply wouldn't be possible without Dr. Carey and her specialized training and her ability to get us through those discussions in an efficient and also enjoyable way, because it's tiring, they're long days, and having a great facilitator really keeps the process enjoyable. Sponsorship also goes to things like honorariums that we pay our task force members for the massive amount of work that they do. So this is something that is basically an expression of our appreciation. It certainly doesn't provide the level of compensation for the amount of time that they put into it, but it's a sign of our appreciation. So the sponsorship helps us to be able to do these things for the guidelines, but at the same time, corporate sponsors do not provide any input into the content of the guidelines or the recommendations or the topics that we cover. They are kept completely separate from that process. All of our task force discussions, the writing and editing and review period are all confidential. Everyone signs NDAs involved in the process, which means that they can't talk about it outside of that process. And we really, it's very, very important to me personally and to AAHA to maintain the integrity of that process, so that our experts' recommendations are based on evidence and based on a consensus of their own expert experience in treating cases. So that's a very important part of the process. And I just wanted to quickly address that, because I do feel like there's a lot of confusion about what the involvement of corporate sponsors is. And it really is just to support the guidelines so that we can do the kind of things that we're doing and create the kind of guidelines that we create. Yeah, there's actually something else I wanted to say, and it just flew out of my head. I knew this was going to happen once through our discussion.
No worries. No worries. It happens to everybody. But thank you for clarifying that, because I'm sure that's been in the back of other people's, at least some other people's minds, wondering, what does it mean that a guideline is sponsored by such and such a company? It's a pharmaceutical company or something else. Like, how does that affect the content in the guidelines? And so it's helpful to be clear that it doesn't. It doesn't affect what goes into the guidelines, the topics that are covered, the medications that are mentioned or recommended, or anything like that.
Absolutely. And like I said, it is very important to us and to me personally that the integrity of the process is maintained and that separation is maintained, and also transparency as well, which is why I didn't want to bring this up and address this, because I do believe it's important that we be transparent in our process and make it clear, how these guidelines are created and where these recommendations come from. And I really want the members of the veterinary profession to have confidence in these guidelines when they come out. And and they do. I mean, like I said, overwhelmingly, I get positive feedback. Overwhelmingly, I get the kind of feedback of where people are happy to be using these guidelines, where they're finding them helpful. But yeah, I just transparency is important, I think.
Yeah, it's everything. It inspires trust. So thank you for sharing about that. I hadn't thought to ask specifically about that. So I appreciate that. Um, well, I'm hoping now that some of the listeners who are listening, whenever they hear this, who maybe haven't taken a look at the guidelines, will go and check some of them out, particularly some of the brand new guidelines like the management of diabetes in cats guidelines that just came out, and we just had Dr. Renee Rosinski on the podcast not that long ago, talking about them, and we've had Dr. Kim Johnson from the oncology guidelines on recently, and some of the other task force members for the other guidelines over the past year or so. So it's been really, really wonderful to hear their passion for the work that they do and the topics that they've been a part of covering on the guidelines, and just knowing that they're bringing that level of expertise and dedication to those task force sessions and all the writing and insight that they provide to the guidelines. It's been very inspiring for me to hear that. So hopefully it will kind of inspire some others to go check out some of the guidelines and see how they could be useful for them in the work that they do. But one thing I wanted to ask you while we're on the topic of inspiration and excitement and all of that, I'd like to ask everyone who comes on the podcast with me what one thing they are excited about within veterinary medicine. It could be something that's happening now or something that you're looking forward to in the future.
Well, certainly advancing technologies and drug developments that are translating to better treatment for animals. And again, not to call out the diabetes management guidelines for cats again, but those guidelines focused heavily on SGLT2 inhibitor drugs for treating cats with diabetes. And I think it's really fantastic and exciting that we now have those available, and that that many of our areas of clinical practice are advancing with new technologies and drug developments. I'm also excited to see, I'm excited about seeing veterinarians speak out more on ethical issues. For example, seeing some exotic veterinarians discussing the ethics of keeping exotic pets, veterinarians speaking out against welfare issues like the use of ventilation shutdown methods for mass euthanasias of farmed animals, and I think it's really great that these issues are entering the consciousness of veterinary medicine. And the other thing I'm really excited about is seeing more interest in the emotional state of our companion animals and what they really need to flourish and thrive in our care. I think that's also something that is entering into the discussion more and more, and I'm excited about those aspects becoming more prevalent in veterinary medicine.
I love both of those answers so much. Thank you. Particularly hearing more people speak up and be interested in all of those different aspects of animal well-being and how we interact with that in the work that we do as veterinary professionals. So very important. And I agree. Very, very exciting to see and look forward to seeing more of it. Well, wonderful. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm hoping this will help others have a better understanding of the guidelines and check them out. Do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with our listeners, or anywhere you'd like to direct them if they want to learn more?
I really appreciate you having me on and giving me the opportunity to talk a bit more about the guidelines. I like you said, I do hope it sheds some light on the process and just inspires more trust and confidence in how we produce these guidelines. If anyone wants to reach out to me or has any questions about the guidelines or wants to suggest a particular topic or really wants to give any feedback or ask any questions, I can be reached at guidelines@aha.org. That is the guidelines email, and anyone is welcome to reach out to me if they have questions or want to give any feedback or suggest anything. And to find the guidelines, you can go to the AHA website at aha.org, and the guidelines are under the tab for veterinary professionals. And if you select that tab, it drops down and there's a selection for AHA guidelines. You will find all of the guidelines that we have currently published listed there, both their websites and also opportunities to download the PDFs and the supplemental materials, the tables and charts and figures from the guidelines.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ingrid. I really appreciate you being here with me today.
Thank you, Emily. I so appreciate this discussion, and thank you so much for having me on.